Within days of the start of World War II, the Junkers Ju-87 had become the most notorious weapon in the German armory. It dropped the very first bombs of the conflict, and as the key component of Hitler's blitzkrieg, it was acclaimed by the Nazis as the ultimate instrument of victory. During the first 9 months of war, it terrorized civilian populations and paralyzed the armies of Western Europe. Reliable to operate and easy to maintain in the field, its ability to absorb punishment and still fly home endeared it to its crews. An astonishing run of successes turned the Shtuka into a household name and gave it an almost mythical reputation. Although it was a long way short of being the most numerous, the Ju-87 became one of the longest-serving aircraft of the entire war. One of the pioneers behind the now universal method of all-metal aircraft construction was the German engineer, Professor Hugo Junkers. He patented the technique, and by 1915 he had designed and built one of the first all-metal stressed skin aeroplanes, the Mercedes-powered Junkers J1. This revolutionary design was developed into an armored two-seater biplane and was used during the First World War as a close support and reconnaissance machine. A handful of other military types followed, including ground attack aircraft and single-seat fighters. In October 1917, Hugo Junkers joined forces with Anthony Fokker to form the Junkers-Fokker Aircraft Company. 2 years later, the new organization was renamed as Junkers Flugzeugwerke. By now, the war was over, and Germany was prohibited from building military machines. The Junkers design team began to concentrate on civil airliners and private sports planes. Their efforts brought success, and in 1921, the company formed its own airline. Within 5 years, it had merged with the rival DLR to form Germany's largest airline, Deutsche Lufthansa. Throughout the 20s, all passenger and transport aircraft built by Junkers were fitted with corrugated metal skins. The material became the company's hallmark. It was used on a number of advanced designs, culminating with the enormously successful Ju-52. While his designers were making good progress with civil aircraft, Hugo Junkers retained a keen interest in military aviation. He bypassed the development ban imposed by the Allies by establishing a number of subsidiary companies outside Germany. In 1928, one of these companies, the Swedish firm of AB Flygindustri, produced a two-seat monoplane designated as the K-47. Specially adapted for research into dive bombing, it became the direct forerunner of the Shtuka. In 1933, after much prompting by the wartime fighter ace Ernst Udet, the German Air Ministry announced an official program to develop an advanced frontline dive bomber. The impressive diving demonstrations by American naval aircraft had already convinced Udet of the need for a German dive bomber. Using the experience gained from the K-47, Junkers began work on a monoplane design known as the Ju-87. The first prototype made its maiden flight in 1935, but disaster struck when it crashed during a dive, killing both the test pilot and his observer. The design of the new aircraft centered around an all-metal smooth stressed skin and a fuselage which was built in two separate longitudinal sections. When it was airborne, the inverted gull wing layout and the large trousered fixed-wheel undercarriage combined to give the machine an extremely ungainly appearance. If it was examined on the ground, it had a surprisingly large appearance, although the overall length was 11 meters and the wingspan was just under 14. At an altitude of 4,000 meters, the 600 horsepower Hummer engine gave a maximum speed of 320 kilometers per hour. The large nose-mounted radiator provided a high level of cooling, and the machine was fitted with a 3-blade variable pitch propeller. Retractable slats under each outboard wing section reduced the maximum speed in a dive to 600 kilometers per hour. A high glazed canopy completely enclosed both cockpits and provided the two-man crew with good all-round visibility. To avoid any risk of the bomb hitting the propeller, a hinged cradle was used to swing the weapon clear just before release. By the end of 1936, the Junkers factory at Dessau was in full-scale production. The Air Ministry had placed an initial order for 250 machines, and deliveries to the Luftwaffe began in the spring of 1937. The first unit to receive the new aircraft was Number 1 Group of Stücke Geschwader 162 Immelmann. Some of its machines were sent to Spain and were tested in action by a bomber group of the Legion Condor. The Legion had already achieved air superiority, and the Ju-87s were used to great effect in several key offensives. They bombed Madrid with great precision and were particularly successful when their attacks were closely coordinated with ground forces. When they were used against shipping, they were just as effective. Repeated attacks mounted against the Spanish Mediterranean ports caused enormous damage to both ships and dockyard installations. By 1938, Spain had become the proving ground for the Stuka. The new tactics developed there would prove a decisive factor 3 years later. Meanwhile, Junkers had produced a more powerful version of the Umo engine. Designated as the 211, it was rated at 1100 horsepower on takeoff. In 1938, it was installed in a new variant of the Stuka, the vastly improved Ju-87B. The increase in power completely transformed the aircraft. Its war load effectively doubled, enabling it to carry both the second crew member and 700 kilograms of bombs. A second machine gun was fitted in the port wing, and an underwing bomb rack was added on each side. A Revi bomb and gun aiming sight replaced the previous diving sight, and increased bombing accuracy still further. To create the maximum level of panic amongst its intended victims, the aircraft could be fitted with a wind-operated siren. Mounted on one of the undercarriage legs, the device created an unmistakable screaming sound as soon as the pilot began his dive-bombing attack. Overall drag was substantially reduced by replacing the large trousered wheel covers for a pair of much more streamlined undercarriage spats. With the increase in engine power, the maximum speed rose by 70 kilometers per hour and the diving speed by 40. The RLM was so impressed with the new variant that it placed an initial order for 400 machines. Junkers stepped up its rate of production, and the first 87Bs were sent to the operational units during late 1938. Within a few months, the Luftwaffe had ordered another 600. Deliveries continued at a steady pace, and by the autumn of 1939, a total of 500 Ju-87s had already entered service. They were divided into 9 separate Stuka groups. The B variant became standard equipment for 5 operational Stuka wings, while all of the older A models were withdrawn from frontline service. Most of them were used for training and were assigned to special schools, known as the Stuka Lehrgeschwader. These units were responsible for converting new pilots and for teaching dive-bombing techniques that had been perfected in Spain. Good judgment was vital for accurate dive-bombing, and with little margin for error, dive training could prove to be a dangerous exercise. The Ju-87 crews suffered their first major loss during a dive-bombing demonstration held at Neuhammer in August 1939. Bad weather cloaked the training area, and 13 aircraft from Stücke Geschwader 76 misjudged their dives and crashed straight into the ground. 2 weeks later, German forces stood poised for the invasion of Poland. With the Luftwaffe certain to gain air superiority, conditions for Stuka operations would be virtually ideal. All 9 groups took part, 3 of them operating in the north, while the other 6 were assigned to the south. As well as supporting the German advance, they were given the task of bombing key installations, such as airfields, railways, shipping and communication centers. The campaign began in the early hours of September 1st. During 4 short weeks of blitzkrieg, the Stukas performed with devastating effect. The majority of the Polish Air Force was quickly destroyed on the ground. And with little or no opposition from defending fighters, the Stukas wrought havoc amongst the Polish ground forces. They destroyed countless army strongpoints, took part in the bombing of Warsaw, and sank most of the Polish surface ships. By the end of the month, Poland had capitulated, and the Stuka had proved its effectiveness beyond any doubt. For the loss of only 30 machines, the dive bomber groups had played a leading role in the first of a long chain of German victories. As Stuka production increased, Germany began to supply the aircraft to other Axis countries. Italy, Romania and Bulgaria all used the dive bomber, and a number of machines were sent to Japan for evaluation. By the spring of 1940, the Luftwaffe had added a 10th Stuka group, and over 700 aircraft were in service. half of these were being held in readiness for the invasion of France and the Low Countries. But in April, a long-range version took part in the assault on Denmark and Norway. Designated as the Ju-87R, it had an operational range of nearly 1,500 kilometers. Modifications to the airframe enabled the machine to carry an extra 150 liters of fuel inside each wing. A pair of drop tanks further increased the capacity by another 600 liters. Each tank was mounted on a special set of braces fitted beneath the bomb racks. They could easily be removed for short-range missions, allowing the aircraft to carry its normal load of bombs. On April 9th, German troops were landed by sea at Copenhagen, Bergen, Narvik, and Trondheim. A simultaneous assault was launched from the air by more than 1,000 bombers and paratroop planes. The Danish army was far too small to put up any effective opposition, and the country had little choice but to surrender almost immediately. But Norway continued to fight, and a combined Allied force was dispatched from England to assist. Within a week, the Germans were in action against several thousand British and French troops, as well as the Norwegian defenders. Most of the Norwegian airfields had been seized by German paratroops, and with complete air superiority, the Luftwaffe was able to employ the same tactics that had proved so successful during the Polish campaign. The Shtuka units of STG-1 were assigned to dive bomb communication centers and troop concentrations. They attacked Allied shipping with great success and sank several British and French destroyers. With no airfields available to them, and with a shortage of anti-aircraft guns, the Allies were in a hopeless situation. They continued to resist for a few more weeks, but by the beginning of May, all Allied troops in the southern part of Norway had begun to evacuate. A few days later, on May 10th, Hitler launched his western offensive, codenamed Operation Yellow. As the panzer columns began their advance into the Low Countries, 2,500 German aircraft attacked airfields throughout Belgium, France, and Holland. Nine Shtuka groups took part, covering the tank operations with more than 350 aircraft. Within 3 days, the majority of the Dutch and Belgian air forces had been destroyed while they were still on the ground. Unopposed from the air, the German tank divisions were able to move swiftly, while paratroop units were deployed to capture key installations. In Holland, the Shtukas bombed Rotterdam, killing almost 1,000 civilians and destroying several thousand buildings. By May 14th, the Dutch had capitulated, and the German armies were starting to move into France. Guderian's tanks attacked through the Ardennes, across the River Meuse near Sedan. The Maginot line outflanked, and the majority of Allied armour pinned down in Belgium by Rommel's tanks, the way was open for a German drive to the Channel coast. While the massed attacks of the panzers forced a corridor straight across France, the Shtukas were employed in their usual roles as terror weapons and flying artillery. Once again, conditions were ideal for the Ju-87s. The Luftwaffe had deployed more than 1,000 Bf-109s and had gained immediate air superiority. In terms of equipment, the French L'Armée de l'Air was no match for the invaders. Of all its aircraft, only the De Voitine D-520 was capable of fighting a Messerschmitt on anything like equal terms. In less than a week, France had lost more than 3/4 of its total fighter strength. In anticipation of the German attack, the RAF had already sent 14 squadrons to France. But they were hopelessly outnumbered, and most were equipped with either the extremely vulnerable Bristol Blenheim or the obsolete Ferry Battle. During the first 8 days of Operation Yellow, the RAF lost 75 battles and 86 Blenheims. Only the 4 Hurricane squadrons could inflict any real damage on the mass of Stukas and Messerschmitts. Stuka casualties for the same 8-day period amounted to just over 50 machines. Although half of these were destroyed by flak, at least 21 were shot down by Hurricanes. For the first time, the Stuka's inherent weaknesses were being exposed in action. It was a reliable and sturdy machine, and as long as the Luftwaffe had air superiority, it was a devastating weapon. But when it was faced with serious fighter opposition, its slow speed and poor defensive armor made it a relatively easy target. On May 14th alone, 5 Ju-87s were shot down by Hurricanes during a single engagement at Terlemont. By May 28th, the Belgian army had finally surrendered, and the remaining British and French troops had withdrawn to the port of Dunkirk. They organized a defensive perimeter, and during the next few days, hundreds of vessels of all shapes and sizes crossed the channel and queued up to lift them off. In an attempt to stop the evacuation, the Luftwaffe threw all available aircraft into the assault. While German ground forces shelled the town's defenses, the Stuka groups were ordered to attack Allied troops assembled in the harbour and on the beaches. They carried out repeated bombing strikes against the Allied rescue fleet, and on June 1st, they sank 3 destroyers and 2 large transports. One of these transports was the Irish mailboat, the Scotia. Heavily laden with more than 2,000 troops, she had just left the harbour when she was hit 3 times. 2 bombs struck the upper deck, but the third went straight down the funnel and sank the ship with the loss of 300 lives. But in spite of these successes, the Stukas were faced with determined attacks by British fighters. Spitfires and Hurricanes, operating in relays from the bases in southern England, inflicted heavy casualties on the dive bomber formations. By June 5th, 900 rescue vessels had snatched away almost 1/3 Allied troops, and the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 200 aircraft in combat over the Dunkirk area. The battle for the rest of France continued for another 2 weeks. Germans reached Paris on the 14th of June, and on the 16th, the French government resigned. Six days later, France surrendered, and as the Luftwaffe took control of the northern airfields, Hitler turned his attentions towards England. To pave the way for an invasion, preparations were made for the destruction of the Royal Air Force. The Luftwaffe reorganized, and two large air fleets were positioned to face Britain from directly across the Channel. Luftflotte 3 was commanded by Field Marshal Spurler and based in western France, while Luftflotte 2 under Field Marshal Kesselring was stationed further north in Belgium and Holland. A third, smaller air fleet, commanded by General Stumpf, was situated at captured airfields throughout Denmark and Norway. Between them, all three Luftwaffen could muster a force of nearly 3,000 aeroplanes. In addition to reconnaissance aircraft, there were 1,260 long-range bombers, 1,100 single-seat fighters, and 320 dive bombers. The Stuka's units were divided up between Air Fleets 2 and 3. Although most of them were assigned to Luftflotte 3, part of Stuka Geschwader 1 came under the control of Luftflotte 2. To counter these large German forces, Britain had just 700 Spitfires and Hurricanes. With numerical superiority and a higher level of battle experience, the Luftwaffe had a distinct advantage over the RAF. The offensive opened in early July, with isolated raids against channel shipping and dockyard installations along the south coast. Escorted by Messerschmitt fighters, the Ju-87s made dive bombing attacks on convoys using 500-kilogram percussion bombs. Many of the early operations were hampered by bad weather, but a major success came on July 25th. Wave after wave of Ju-87s were sent across the Channel to attack a large convoy at Dover. They were assisted by German E-boats and sank 8 ships out of the total of 21. 4 days later, another 50 Stukas escorted by 8109s mounted a second raid on Dover. 1 destroyer was sunk, but this time 4 Stukas were shot down for the loss of only 1 British fighter. On August 8th, the Luftwaffe mounted its largest anti-shipping strike so far. 57 Ju-87s, escorted by a force of 50 Messerschmitts, attacked a 20-ship convoy in 3 separate waves. Intercepted by more than 30 Hurricanes and Spitfires, 8 of the Stukas were shot down, and many more were seriously damaged. Once again, without the protection afforded by air superiority, the vulnerability of the Stuka was being exposed. In the afternoon of August 13th, Goering launched his main offensive against the RAF's airfields. 5 Stukas were shot down by 609 Squadron's fighters during an attempted raid on Middle Wallow. 3 days later, 9 more were destroyed and several others crippled while trying to reach Tangier. It was much the same story on August 18th, when 110 dive bombers were sent to attack Poling radar station, as well as the airfields at Ford, Gosport and Thorney Islands. The raids proved disastrous for Luftflotte 3. 30 Stukas were either shot down or severely damaged. STG-77 alone had 12 aircraft destroyed and another 6 badly mauled by fighters. The events of the 3rd week in August signaled the end of Stuka operations over Britain. On the 19th, every Ju-87 unit within Luftflotte 2 and Luftflotte 3 was withdrawn from the offensive. By the end of the year, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve its objectives over Britain, and Operation Sea Lion had been postponed indefinitely. In 1941, the Stuka Geschwader operated further afield. Under conditions of German air supremacy, they began to repeat their earlier successes. In January, they bombed Malta, inflicting heavy damage on the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious and sinking the cruiser Southampton. Between April and June, they took part in the German victories in Greece, Yugoslavia, and Crete. At Crete, they sank several Royal Navy destroyers and another British cruiser, HMS Gloucester. On the morning of June 22nd, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Soviet Russia. As usual, the Stuka's units formed the spearhead. In a series of well-timed attacks, much of the Soviet Air Force was destroyed on the ground. By the end of the month, German pilots had claimed more than 4,000 Russian aircraft for the loss of less than 200 of their own machines. In September, the German ground forces reached Leningrad and were heavily shelled by the Russian battleships Marat and October Revolution. Led by Hans Ulrich Rudel, the Stukas of STG-2 attacked both ships and sank the Marat. Rudel went on to become one of the most famous of all Ju-87 pilots. By the end of the war, he had flown over 2,500 missions and was credited with the destruction of more than 500 Russian tanks. As the only holder of the Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, he became the most highly decorated pilot in the Luftwaffe. By the end of 1941, a new Stuka variant had begun to replace the Ju-87V. With a larger wingspan and a more powerful engine, it was able to carry a bomb load of up to 1,800 kilos. Extra armor was fitted, and a twin machine gun replaced a single 7.9mm in the rear cockpit. Known as the Dora, it gave rise to a long chain of subtypes, and over the next 3 years, it became the most numerous of all Stuka variants. More than 3,000 examples were built, representing over half the total production. The last main variant to be built was the Ju-87G. Designed specifically for use against tanks, the standard dive brakes were removed, and two 37mm anti-tank cannon were fitted beneath the wings. Although it was heavier and much less maneuverable, the aircraft had formidable firepower and was capable of destroying almost any Soviet tank. After armament testing at Rekhlin, the Gustav entered service in 1943, just in time for the Battle of Kursk. It was issued to a number of specially formed anti-tank units, and for the rest of the Russian campaign, it inflicted heavy losses on the Soviet armor. In Africa, tropicalized versions of the Shtuka had been used to support Rommel's Africa Corps since 1942. Fitted with long-range tanks and dust filters, they took part in many major operations, including the bombing of Tobruk and the Battle of El Alamein. When the British 8th Army began its counter-offensive in January 1943, the Shtuka unit suffered enormous casualties at the hands of Allied fighters. By the end of May, losses had become so severe that the remaining units had to be withdrawn from frontline duties in the desert. In spite of its development program, the Ju-87 became more and more vulnerable as the war progressed. Junkers failed to produce an adequate successor. And until the Focke-Wulf 190 became available in numbers, the Shtuka continued to serve as the Luftwaffe's standard dive bomber and ground attack aircraft. But by the autumn of 1944, nearly all of the Shtuka Geschwader had re-equipped with a much more formidable Focke-Wulf. Under a program of rapid reorganization, all dive bomber units have been absorbed by the Luftwaffe's new ground attack wings. Less than 300 Shtukas were still serviceable on all fronts, and many of these were relegated to night attack duties. In September, after a total of 5,700 machines had rolled off the lines, Ju-87 production ceased altogether. Although a few isolated units remained operational until the end of the war, the age of the Shtuka was effectively at an end. 50 years later, the aircraft is still a household name. Its lasting reputation is ensured by countless propaganda films made at the very height of its success.
mit eurem Einbild. Sag doch auch was, Mensch. Jawohl, Herr Oberleutnant, war prima. Der Oberleutnant hat doch richtig drin gehalten. Das heißt wie ich, die ganze 8. Staffel, pack ich wie beim Reichsparteitag. Oder danke, Steiner. Nach Küken, war das ein Ding? Enorm, Herr Lutz. Wirklich ganz enorm. Eine heile 9. Staffel, Männer, ihr habt nicht schlecht geworfen. Vielen Dank. Der Kommandeur schon gelandet. Na klar, ist doch mit der Kavalierstaffel geflogen. Ach, mit der Kavalierstaffel. Habt ihr die Kavalierstaffel? Das ist der erste, Herr Hauptmann.
Hallo, alles da?
Jawohl, Reichsbruder. Die ganze Mahara versammelt.
Herr Siel.
Herr Siel, vollzählig.
Vater.
Vater, vollzählig. Die ganze vornehme Stuka-Welt im Anmarsch auf Lüttich.
Achtung! Vater Persil. Reihenfolge. Reichsbruder. Vater Persil. Es geht los! Die Kürze!
Fenster nehmen und gib! Und jetzt! Au! Volltreffer! Geht eine Rinne, Hauptmann! Das ganze Boot weggepustet!
Wer war das?
Einer von der 9. Hauptmann!
Persil. Hallo Persil. Gratuliere! Gerade den Volltreffer.
Küken, Hauptmann!
Bravo. Bravo.
Danke, Hauptmann!
Ja, habt ihr? Glaube ich nicht auf Bord. Wir sind ja auf Lautsprecher umschalten. Schnell!
Was werdet ihr euer Leben lang nicht mehr sehen?
Post an Post, soweit das Auge reicht.
Die Stühle voller Tommys und Autos und alles will in die Schippe. Da wollen wir ihn aber versalzen. Nur die großen Fette nehmen. Hinein!
Da ich dabei sein.
Meter mehr! Hans! Hallo Hans! Warum? So ein Antworten liegt nicht hinter uns?
Schnell auf, Mann!
Hallo Hans, Bilde!
Der Motor ist hin. Ölheizung zerschossen. Oberleutnant, es kommt einer runter. Es holt uns einer. Hat ja keinen Zweck, hier kann doch keiner landen. Nach todsiger Bruch. Leg ab, er soll oben bleiben. Er schwebt ein, Oberleutnant. Er fliegt. Er landet. Ich glaube, das ist Oberleutnant von Bomberg. Was?
Da rennen ist er. Der Pilzsau. Aber rauskommt der nie.
Geht runter, Oberleutnant.
Ach nee, meine sind los. Komm mit, Mann. Die Maschine ist sowieso im Eimer.
Oh! Einmal die faulen Knochen zusammen. Los, Hans, steig ein. Nee, ich bin drauf. Warum denn nicht? Dann lass ich mich lieber so ein Zombie fahren. Bist du von dem Bad gebissen, ha? Ja, wenn ich mit dir fliegen würde, du kommst doch hier nie raus. Außerdem muss ich meine Mühle in Brand setzen. Die Mühle, Herr Oberleutnant. Komm lieber näher. Los, Vater, lass dich die Kiste fliegen. Da geht's nach. Dich in die Füße. Los, bring in die Mühle. Das ist denn uns auf deiner Rechnung mit dem Himmel vor. Was meinen wir, Oberleutnant? Einsteigen sollst du ein. Los! Los, ab dafür! Zacke mit Loch! Und now, meine Herren, halt auf mein Wort. Noch erst den Angriff auf England. Hurra! Noch eine Frage. An die Maschine!
Jawohl! Vater Persil, alles da?
Jawohl, Heim! Die ganze Mahala wieder versammelt. Zum Paragraph und Vollmist dabei.
Jawohl, zum Postlaufmann! Selber total verblüfft! Ich springe angesichts der großen Stunde restlos zum Steine gejagt! Ja, oder hört, Männer! Aber hinein mit Sack und Flöte!